Welcome to this seminar about the Collab Mapping project. I'm Darinka Czischke. I'm associate professor at the Faculty of Architecture and the Built Environment at the TU Delft. And I was also the leader of this project, which aimed to create a database of different collaborative housing projects in Europe, building on existing databases, and to transform it into an interactive online visualization tool. I have some guests today to comment on the presentation of this tool. Today's objective is actually focusing on this data visualization tool that we are launching today online. I will start with a presentation, a very brief presentation of the project, which will be followed by the actual presentation of the tool by my colleague Sara Brysch, who was leading the production of the tool. And after that, we will have a panel discussion with some national and international experts on the importance of collecting data on collaborative housing in order to better understand the trends and the challenges of these housing forms to prosper. So we would like to start then with the presentation of the okay, I cannot see it on the big screen, so I cannot see what I am presenting.
How good are your eyes?
How old are you?
So maybe I can approach.
Yeah.
Now I can see it. Sorry about that technical flip, but now we can see. So the Collab Mapping project started with the realization that even though collaborative housing forms, that means collectively self-organized and self-managed housing projects, have been growing in popularity in the last couple of decades at least, and also there's a lot of research coming up about it. Most of this research and this knowledge is of qualitative nature. That means we have a lot of knowledge about case studies and about processes and other kind of qualitative indicators that tell us about how these practices take place and why are they initiated. However, what we do not have is quantitative data which is comparable and allows us to track the trends in this sector, meaning how many projects of which kind, where are they being realized. So the goal of this project was indeed to map collaborative housing forms in a scientifically informed database and then be able to visualize them. We have cooperated with a number of organizations in this effort. First of all, with Urbamonde, which is an NGO focused on community-led and collaborative housing projects around the world. And they already have a database of what we call best practices. However, the next challenge for us was to really give this categorization a scientific basis. So we joined forces with Urbamonde to do this. We've also been cooperating with an architecture firm who are very active in the actual design and development of collaborative housing in the Netherlands because we wanted to test our categorization and our visualization tool with real practitioners who are using this data. And last but not least, we would like to thank the Dutch National Research Council, NVO, for a grant that we were awarded in order to carry out this project. So overall, we consulted 26 national experts from across Europe. 50% of them were practitioners, so people actually developing, realizing collaborative housing, and 50% were researchers. And we covered 10 countries across the European Union, as you can see on the slide. So why categorize collaborative housing? As we know from earlier work in this field, we see collaborative housing not as a type of housing in itself, but rather as an umbrella term that encompasses a wide variety of, as I said before, collectively self-organized and self-managed housing forms that are growing. The interest in this type of housing is growing. However, we need to better understand, as I said before, what are the hard figures and what are the trends? Is this actually growing, or do we think this is growing because they are becoming more visible? And we see that the first step in this effort, if we want to quantify and compare these different forms, is to get rid of certain hurdles which have to do with the confusion of the terminology. So very often we have discussions about what are we talking about when we talk about collaborative housing. Is it co-living? Is it cooperative housing? Is it community-led housing? There are different terms that are being used often interchangeably, even though they do not necessarily mean the same. Further complication in this effort to categorize arises when we have the local terminologies in the national or local languages, because then we add another layer of cultural differences in how the meaning we attribute to these different terms. So in our project, we set out to unravel this by firstly building on existing work, mostly academic work, being done on the conceptualization of collaborative housing as a phenomenon. So we took as a working definition collaborative housing conceptualizations developed on the basis of large-scale literature research and also case studies, from which we drew a number of assumptions in terms of what are the defining features of this type of housing. And we applied a Delphi panel methodology. That means we consulted experts who were geographically dispersed, and they could give us their views, their insights on the meanings of these different terms through a series of questionnaires. In between two rounds of surveys with these experts, we conducted an intermediate analysis. We supported it with further literature review, and we also gave feedback to the experts with regards to their input, and we asked them to clarify any remaining questions. So at the end of this, we generated first a taxonomy or classification of collaborative housing forms, as I said, very much informed by the input from local experts. And this was done in an iterative fashion with the literature review that we conducted at the beginning, which gave rise to the mother term, as we call it, of collaborative housing. So when I say this was an iterative process, what I mean is we created a dialogue between the theory and the practice. And we have two outputs, two results coming out of this project. One is the systematic categorization. We have presented this work already in academic conferences, but what we want to focus on today in this seminar or webinar is on presenting to you the resulting online mapping and visualization tool. This is just to briefly mention that this was the working definition that we took from the literature on what collaborative housing encompasses. And this is also just a brief peek at the resulting taxonomy. You will be able to read about this taxonomy and the way we came to it in a forthcoming journal paper. So keep tuned and stay tuned. And now, without further ado, I will give the floor to my colleague Sara Brysch, who is gonna present the actual tool.
Thank you, Darinka. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy not only to be here today, but also to be part of this incredible project. My task today is to introduce you and to guide you through the platform that resulted from this project. So I will move myself to that station so then we can start exploring. I don't know if I need some... Okay. Can you see it? You see it?
Yes, there.
So for those who are watching online, there's an online chat in case you have some comments or questions, so feel free to use it. So this is the platform. Shara. I just have to say that this is a starting point of a continuous work on collecting quantitative and information data about the collaborative housing phenomenon in Europe. We start, as Darinka mentioned, with these 10 countries, but the idea is to continue engaging with existing and even future umbrella organizations on collaborative housing, so we can make these numbers as more accurate and representative as possible. And another thing is that the aim here was not to pinpoint the exact projects in the map. This is something that, as Darinka mentioned, Urbomund is doing with their project cohabitat.io. The aim here is to show aggregated data, quantitative data, that can assist comparative and quantitative studies on the field of collaborative housing. So this is where these two projects, in a way, complement each other. So let's start exploring. So this is the main page. In case you want to have some additional information about the project itself, we can come here into the About, and then it goes to the Collab Mapping Project website, and specifically to the Mapping Project webpage, where there's a general explanation, something like that Darinka just explained. We will also include the list of participants of the Delphi panel. We are still waiting for some confirmations. That's why it's still not uploaded, but we will in the future. And now, here we show two types of information. So we show quantitative data with these numbers that we collect from the umbrella organizations, and also some qualitative data, which has to do with the categorization system Darinka just mentioned. And we also show information at two different levels. So at the national level, and we can access it by just clicking on the countries, and at the European level, so we can have like an overall view of some numbers. So about the quantitative part, each file we received from the umbrella organizations, in this case, for this, let's say, in a pilot study, we started with UK, Denmark, and Sweden. So for each file that we received, the list of projects were organized according to their specific requirements. So there was a need to find a common ground, to start organizing the data that we received. So we selected a few labels, let's say, and these are projects, number of dwellings per project, so we could see the scale of the projects. Also the completions by year, housing tenures, and legal forms, as we can see here. And then it was also important to provide a definition for each label. So what do we mean by projects? And in this case, we can see here a short definition that we have, what we mean by dwellings, what we mean by housing tenure, and the different options that we define. So it was very important to create a solid and coherent basis to guarantee the accuracy of the information we were receiving. So, for instance, many terms were often provided in their native language and had to be discussed and tested against our definitions. So if we want to have an overview of the numbers of Europe, of course, in this case, it only represents 3 countries. But as I said, this is a starting point. We want to continue to increase the information. So this is the basis where we start. And we can have here a general idea, the number of projects we're collecting, the number of dwellings. And then if we click here in dwellings per project, we can have an overview of the numbers, and we can automatically see that the scale of the projects are relatively small, at least in these countries. We can also distinguish the different countries here, as you can see. And then we can go on. We can go to completions by year, and then we see here a graph showing, again, the different numbers in each country. But of course, we always need to be careful by looking at these numbers, because at first sight, it seems like at the European level, there was a peak in the year 2000, but it was actually a peak only in Denmark. So if you look at the other countries, there were not so many numbers. So of course, we need also to be careful by reading this. And then if we click in housing tenures, again, another graph appears with the different numbers. I will not spend too much time looking at this specifically, but I want to show that for each type of housing tenure, we provide a short definition that has to be confirmed by the umbrella organization, so that we have, as I mentioned, a coherent overview that can relate to all the different countries. And then again, legal forms. And this is a growing process, so we start with this. Of course, there might be more in the future. And then again, we provide these definitions, which are extremely useful to understand these numbers at the European level. And now I close here. And then if we want to have a look at a specific country, then we have here a legend. So for these 3 countries, we have quantitative data and the local definitions of the different collaborative housing forms. For these light grays, we only have local definitions. We will see that in a moment. So if I click here in the UK, we can have a good overview of the whole spectrum. Of course, in this case, we can always look at the data sources, and then we can see that in the UK, we are only considering community land trusts. So this does not represent the whole collaborative housing phenomenon in the country. But again, the idea is to combine different databases, so then in the end we have a more comprehensive collection. But for here, we are looking at the existing CLTs at the UK. So again, we can see the number of projects, again, the definitions. Here we also include the ones that are active, so they are functioning already, and the ones that are under development. And the graphs, let me just close here. The graphs also show the information according to the ones that are developing and active. So again, I'm not gonna lose much time on the content itself, but just to show you that if the page looks a bit dense, so it might be a bit overwhelming, but the idea is that we can easily compare to other countries and see what are the main differences. And this is quite important when we are doing some comparative studies. So I'm just coming back to UK, because after looking at this quantitative data, we have then another level, which is the qualitative one, which has to do with the local definitions that were defined with this Delphi panel, as Darinka mentioned, together with the literature and our own analysis. So for this local definition, so for the UK, we have this number of collaborative housing forms. In this case, everything in English, but let's just go to Denmark. So then we can see that we provide the local definition in their native language. And then we also provide a translation, which was confirmed by the umbrella organization. This is also very important. And then a short description about it. If we click in the countries that we still do not have any quantitative data, we have, as I mentioned, the description of the different local designations. Of course, this is still a work in progress, so this may change because the debates will still continue. And then, if we come back to the main page, we have like this second layer of analysis, which is in a way combining all the local definitions into what Darinka already shown, into a taxonomy. And this is much cooler than the image that Darinka showed, because you can actually play around. It's a very beautiful taxonomy, so tree-like system. I will also not spend too much time explaining how and why did we organize this, and this is still under debate. The idea is that to show that this is the total number of local designations that we collected from these countries. So the idea is to continue and include other countries as well. So always with a short definition. And this is what we have in the end. And this is quite useful, the way it's displayed, because in quantitative studies or even qualitative studies, it's quite handy and quite a visually attractive way of showing the different collaborative housing forms existing in Europe. So I think this is basically it. We can then go back to map. It's quite a simple tool, so nothing too complicated. The idea is that it's very user-friendly. This is the web address. We will also provide it at the Collab Mapping website. So we are very curious to hear your thoughts, your comments, and questions about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sara, for that presentation of the tool. And I would just like to add to that or emphasize that this is a first step at trying to bring together existing databases on different collaborative housing forms across Europe. And of course, we have had to deal with a number of issues of data collection cycles, local definitions, validity and reliability of the data, etc. And this probably is part of the explanation why we started only with the 3 countries with databases that we considered let's say, good enough in terms of their quality to visualize. But our aim, of course, is to grow the databases, to grow the visualization possibilities. And for this, it's really important that we do a collective effort. We see it a bit as a wiki project in the sense that we would like to invite as many of you as possible to contribute to this effort by providing data, making it accessible, engaging with us in the discussion of this taxonomy we are proposing. Because again, the taxonomy or the classification, by that I mean these labels, they are not set in stone. They are our first effort to try and make sense and classify these different forms. Another important thing to mention is that this is a snapshot of a moment in time. And as we know, many of these forms have long-standing traditions and have evolved over time and will continue to evolve. So this is another aspect to consider in this effort, that this is a dynamic picture. And having said that, I would like now to invite our invited speakers to contribute with their views, their suggestions, the comments on what we have presented. So just a brief introduction of everyone we have here today, on site and also online. There are 2 fellow researchers from Collab Research at the TU Delft. The one is Sara, of course, you have met her. The other one is our colleague Carla Huisman, who is joining us remotely. Carla is a sociologist and she's an expert on housing, social housing and collaborative housing, and she's been instrumental in shaping up the taxonomy that we are proposing today. And next to me, we also have Michael LaFond. Michael is an architect and co-houser and thinker and activist. He's many things. He's a key person, in my view, in developing the movement of co-housing, collaborative housing in Europe. We're very happy to have Michael here with us on site, and also because he was one of the experts consulted for the Delphi panel. And last but not least, we have my former colleague, Alice Pittini, joining us from Brussels. Alice is the director of Housing Europe Observatory. So Alice is also a very experienced person with collecting data, making sense of different data sets, right? So we're very happy to have her here with us. So I would like to start actually with Michael, perhaps because he, as I said, he was participating in our Delphi panel. So what are your thoughts about the result, Michael? And you can be totally honest. Please.
Thank you, Darinka.
90% honest.
Thanks for inviting me to Delft, to this wonderful small city here in Holland. And Thank you, Sarah, for that presentation. Yeah, I'm honored to be part of the discussion today. I've been working off and on at the European level for the last 10 years, and before that another 10 years in Berlin. And so I understand the challenge. It's it's a terrific challenge, and I have to say that I'm impressed so far with the initial results of at least making a good start at categorizing collaborative housing and getting us started documenting the amazing diversity of the European landscape. I mean, the challenge, you did a good job of introducing it and describing it. Obviously, it's a big one. We're looking at housing, which is a cultural phenomenon, and we're putting it into scientific categories, and we're dealing with a dynamic landscape over time, but also geographically speaking. And this dynamic doesn't allow itself to be very easily nailed into little boxes. But I still think it's important that you're doing that. And I realize with my own work in Berlin and Germany, and to a certain extent internationally, that we very much need quantifiable data. Most of what we've had to work with for the last 20 years, or if you go back 40 years, is qualitative. Lots of nice stories of people describing their own projects, which are wonderful, to find out, as you said, how things happen and why. But to be able to compare them and to have any numbers, we've just been swimming around. And this is obviously important for research, but also for policy and politics. And that's a weakness in Berlin and Germany until today. There hasn't been enough research, there hasn't been enough quantification, and for this reason, all we have is a lot of qualitative data. And when we talk to the government, if we talk to government bureaucrats, we say, well, we've got a lot of wonderful projects, and you are challenged, well, how many are there, and are there more or less? What are the kinds of projects? Then we are at a loss. So I think it's an incredibly important thing. So I appreciate you getting started on that. Maybe one question for you, a question we've had in Berlin or in Germany over the last, years and decades is, if we have this broad definition of collaborative housing, which encompasses many things, which I think is good, cooperative housing, co-housing, even community land trusts, what percentage of the housing market do we add up to? And if I look at Berlin or Germany, then my answer is we're somewhere around 1%, maybe not even 1%, which is a little bit, how do we say, it's a modest, still a modest number. But even that is important to be realistic and say, what is it with the housing market? If we look at housing cooperatives in Berlin and Germany, we add up to 10%. So I would, but I don't always include the cooperatives in the collaborative housing definition. So it's a question of the definition, but I think to understand how much of an impact we're having on the housing market, which has to do with resources, it has to do with power, it has to do with how many people, that's something that we need to know in Berlin, like, okay, what are the city housing companies, what are the cooperatives, what is co-housing? So usually I end up saying to focus it so it's not all of the cooperative housing, so I come back to about 1% of the total. Maybe one last point, I really like the idea of this developing as a wiki project. And looking at the presentation, I had the idea of Wikipedia and sort of an open platform, which I think is quite attractive and quite close to the spirit of community housing, that it's participatory, it's not always self-organized, but it's definitely got an interest in community and sharing. So to emphasize this being something of an open and transparent platform that people can understand and maybe can contribute to, commenting on definitions, making or suggesting changes and so on. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Michael, I think you touch on a number of issues that we've already encountered in the process of the last year and a half or so. I think the issue of definitions is key, definitely, because depending on what you include in your definition, the numbers can change significantly, of course. And the cooperative form, for instance, that has lent itself to a lot of discussions, also in our academic workshops. What is a cooperative? And in that sense, for instance, our first distinction, if you remember the taxonomy, has to do with what motivates, what is the main motivation of the project itself. Is it self-provision, so a rather pragmatic motivation, self-provide housing for yourself as part of a group, or is it an idealistic motivation? Is it to live together with others in close contact? And sometimes, rather often, these two motivations coincide. So it's extremely difficult to draw clear-cut lines between one or the other. We would argue that it's more like a mix of different motivations that guides specific projects. And this makes the picture even more complex, of course. Having said that, I mean, as researchers, what we are aiming at is to shed more clarity on the issue of motivations in order to distinguish this from conventional housing provision, which is what collaborative housing is not. And by that we mean the resident as either a consumer of housing, purely, a client, a customer, who goes to the market and buys or rent, or as a beneficiary, which is a situation in classical social rental, where you are eligible on the basis of a set of characteristics of your household, you're eligible for state-subsidized housing. So collaborative housing is something that, well, plays in between, but it has this added dimension of intentionality to live as a group, to collaborate as a group. And that can either happen in different tenures. And this is actually one of the main difficulties to find data, to classify it as such. Because the data today is collected in terms of tenure. And that's a very restrictive definition where we want to make sense of what drives people to want to work and live as a group in housing. So that's been the main issue we've had to deal with.
Maybe just one more comment on that. As you're saying, I think I can agree with developing the categories, and I think it has to start somewhere. And at least when we know what you're talking about or we're talking about, we can say, yes, okay, that's a landscape that I can understand. For me, then, it's really a question of the emphasis, because there's so many overlaps, right, between these categories. For me, one of the major differences that I see emerging is the emphasis either on self-organized or on professionally provided. And so a community land trust, for me then, moves it over to the professionally provided, but gives the opportunity for the community. And maybe even the community is not there so strong in the beginning, but it has the opportunity to manage itself. So the idea of, in Berlin, was very strong for the last 4 decades, self-organized, yeah, we squat buildings, we do things for ourselves. But it's moving more and more towards architects and developers, the provision. And many people say, well, but is that still community housing? Maybe it's not community-led, but the community can be strong. And maybe it's not even there so strong when they move in, but they're living in a cluster group or something, and they have this opportunity. Indeed. So, yeah, it's...
That's something we also came across, and in our research, in other studies we do, we come across very strongly on that, which is the trend towards what we call professional housing providers to, let's say, operate with collaborative logics by enabling the tenants or the residents to self-organize, to self-manage, to take on a number of collective activities that give them more autonomy over their living situation. And we include it as part of the collaborative housing definition. But here I would maybe like to give the floor to my colleagues also to comment on these issues briefly. Carla, Sara, do you have, maybe Carla has some views on this.
And how far, can you hear me, by the way, properly?
Yes.
Yes,
Could be better.
good. I like that. I first want to say I'm very happy with seeing the presentation of the tool. It looks very pretty and helpful. Like I'm very happy how to know. But I will jump into the question at hand. Actually, in how far does it need to be self-organized? Well, I would agree very much with Michael that even if projects are indeed organized by professionals, if there is enough involvement and also a say, power of residents once the project is set up, that would be, for us at least, part of the definition of collaborative housing. Because one of the defining features for us, or for me, for collaborative housing is that residents do need to, as a collective, have enough involvement, enough of a say to really self-determine part of their housing. So that would actually mean that some projects then perhaps do not count and some don't, so that you really have to look at this very specific characteristics of specific projects to determine whether they're part of it. Yeah.
And if I may add something, this is also why we are not including co-living initiatives in our definition, because you have the community spirit in a way, so people live together and they share facilities, but they are not involved either in the planning or in the management of their housing. So this is why we also excluded co-living initiatives.
Thank you. So, Alice, I'm curious about your take on this. You have worked for many years, and at the beginning we worked together on trying to make sense of a lot of different data and definitions coming from across Europe. Remember those days, trying to make sense of it? Cooperative, public, not-for-profit, etc. So what do you make of this new kid in town, collaborative housing?
Thanks a lot, Darinka. Thank you for involving me in this event today. And let me start by congratulating Darinka, Sara, and everybody involved in the project, because I think it's really an excellent result, or maybe I should say an excellent starting point, what you presented this morning, because as you said, it's a work in progress. From a European perspective, it's quite it's really a welcome output. I think it really fills a gap in the existing knowledge, because collaborative housing is a term that has been increasingly in the spotlight, I think, for all those involved in housing at different levels over the recent years. But actually, it's still quite relatively unknown and obscure area for many, I think. So this really helps shedding a light on what it is that we're talking about. And it's really the first attempt that I see to try to collect quantitative data as well at the cross-country level. So it's really quite impressive. I have some just first reactions and ideas to what you showed. I think one key point for me that I find really important and really interesting is that rather than starting from let's say a one-box definition approach, you start from a taxonomy or a categorization with multiple aspects to be taken into account. And I think this is extremely important, and it's really a big thumb up from my side for this effort indeed, because as you mentioned, Darinka, we see it a lot. For instance, when talking about social housing or public housing, which are terms that have been around for centuries, but there's still, a lot of confusion that comes from the fact that there's no one single definition at European level. And this may be, it's also another point. I think whenever we look for this kind of data, we probably do it with a purpose. It can be different purposes. For Housing Europe, the link with policy is always important, of course. So I think in this sense, definitely, as we call more and more for evidence-based policies at European, but also national and local level, this is really something that can help making better informed policy decisions. On this, what I wanted to say, I think I find it also really interesting in your project. I've been myself working rather on databases collecting very macro level data, typically data at national level coming from census or whether it's a different Eurostat surveys. But I think what is interesting here is that basically you try to bring to the national level very concrete and local examples and data that are embedded in certain projects. And of course, this is, I think it makes it very, very complicated, and maybe there will be a lot of discussion about what is included and what is not. But I think it's an interesting way to go about this, and it really fills a gap. What we see, for instance, at European level, the institutions often still focus on macro data about house prices, about housing affordability, that completely miss the importance of the local dimension. So, chapeau also for this. I think I have two questions. The first question would be, as you mentioned, you see this as almost a wiki exercise where you're hoping that different stakeholders can provide data and basically help you enrich the database. So I wonder whether you have already thought about ways to go about engaging stakeholders and enlarging the database, keeping in mind that probably, especially, I mean, as you know already, the coverage in terms of available data might be very good in some countries, not that good in others. So this may pose some challenges on the long term. And then I have one last question that is really just to provoke maybe some discussion. I think the tool itself seems quite user-friendly, and as mentioned by Carla, it is really pretty, which I appreciate. But in the end, so data visualization, especially when approaching a wider public or a wider audience, so when it's not used only for let's say the purpose of academic research, in the end it's about telling a story. So I wonder if you can tell us, from this first tool you've developed, what would be the key story about collaborative housing in Europe. And from my side, I hope it can be a story about something starting small and going big, but I leave this to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Alice. Those are very interesting questions for us as well, indeed. Well, if I may start, then I would like to give the floor to my colleagues, of course. We actually are very keen to engage more stakeholders who hold this data, who collect it, who have access to this data all across Europe. And this is why we are trying to disseminate this work as widely as possible, you see. That includes Housing Europe. We would very much like to cooperate with you, for instance, because you have a fantastic membership of many organizations who at local level are actually working with collaborative housing approaches, right? So we have them with the housing associations in Amsterdam, for instance, who are doing the start block model, just to mention one, or the French Habitat Participatif Social. I know that many French HLM are collaborating with the groups of residents to make their housing situation more participatory, more collaborative as well. So it would be wonderful, for instance, to enlarge our database with that sort of projects, let's say. And we're inviting everyone who wants to cooperate. As I said, this is an open effort. And what we do as researchers, we see our role as to check, the quality of the data, of course, that is reliable, that is valid data, and apply our taxonomy, which in itself will also change interactively with the comments. And it's like a Wikipedia, right? I mean, you have editing constantly to improve the quality of the information. And in that sense, we are kind of the chief editor, so to speak. That's the way I see our role. But we don't determine in a top-down fashion, okay, this is collaborative housing. No, we want to co-create the term. That's our aim. And the story, wow, okay, I think that's a really good question, because I think we've been so busy collecting the data and trying to make sense of it on a technical level, if you wish, that we have kind of forgotten to see if there is a story emerging through the data. I think it's very early days, because as you saw, we only have 3 countries where we can kind of tell a story, but we would love to be able to tell a story. That's why we're doing this, I think, no? What do Sara and Carla think?
I think if I can start, we can already tell a short story about the taxonomy at least. So I think the way we organize and the way we group these different collaborative housing forms already say something. So, but again, it's the start of a long story, or hopefully a long story. So in that sense, on the qualitative part of this project, I think we are able, and this journal output that we are preparing, I think you will tell a bit. But about the way we engage with data and the stakeholders and other umbrella organizations, I would also like to add that this structure that we produce to filter the data can also help umbrella organizations to organize their own data. So we are in touch with an organization on the cooperative housing in UK, and they were actually willing to use the labels that we prepared, so they could start organizing their data in a more structured way. So then they could actually collaborate with us in a more practical and direct way. So this is also helpful for these small organizations who start seeing this collaborative housing phenomenon happening in their region or country, and they want to start collecting information about it, but they are not sure how to, because as Darinka is saying, usually information is only about housing tenure, but there's an extra layer here. So we also are keen to engage with umbrella organizations who want to start organizing their own data on that. So it's a kind of a two-way collaboration. This is Carla, do you want to say something? On the story, maybe.
Comment or a question.
Yeah, is Carla frozen? Sorry.
Yeah, it's
yeah, now
yeah,
she's
there.
Okay.
yeah, you're moving. Sorry. There.
Hello?
Yes.
I'm back. I think I missed the last thing of what Sara said, but I did want to say lots of things. Because I was reminded, in terms of the story, I was reminded of the presentation we gave indeed at the scientific conference, where we presented the idea of the Tower of Babel, because you have all these people in these different countries, people that organize projects, residents, people of umbrella organizations, and they're all involved in collaborative housing, but they all call it in their own language, and because of cultural differences, this is not part of collaborative housing and this not. And what we saw also at the scientific level is that this hinders communication and thus also understanding, both in a science and a policy way. So the beginning of our story is to help translate so that people can talk with each other on an international level, and then we can see developments also. We can combine the quantitative and the qualitative and see, okay, what is going on, while understanding still the cultural or national differences. So we're not making it so that we put everything in a box that it's the same, because that does not make sense. So that would be part of the story, also to show, but actually we call it different in different countries, but actually this happens everywhere and it's larger than you actually think. Mm-hmm. I think this would for me be also part of a story. There was something else I wanted to say, because I was reminded of my own research on temporary rent in the Netherlands, and here the problem is that people say it is marginal, so we don't need to measure it. Because we don't measure it, we can continue to think it's marginal. Right? This is very self-reinforcing. And you see the same a bit with collaborative housing, because Michael LaFond says, okay, maybe it's 1%. I think, yeah, maybe, but maybe it's more, but we don't know, because we don't properly measure it, so we can continue to have it as a marginal thing. And then I think, so that's why I think this project is very good in trying to quantify, but I think at the same time, we also need to look at other ways. The idea to involve projects to be part of the wiki approach is a very good idea, but I think at the same time we need to see whether we can, for instance, in national surveys, whether we can enter also questions about collaborative housing, because otherwise we're always only relying on projects and umbrella organizations, and they are very uneven in the sense that starting projects are more interested in it, or projects that are on a thread. Projects that have been established for a long time and are functioning and do not need anything have less of an interest to become part of such things. So if you would do a national survey, or you would include things in national surveys, then this could be really very helpful to see what is going on. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Carla. Yes, I agree with you. If you don't measure something, it will always continue to be marginal. I think that's a very important argument also that we would put forward. Why doing this? Even if it's small, well, let's see if it keeps being small over the years, or if it's actually growing. Because for me, one of the powerful things about regular data collection is to show the trends, show the change. And this should be taken into account by policymakers at different levels, right? Michael, you whispered to me that you had other points to make.
Yeah, thank you, Darinka. Yeah, just a couple of comments. So one would be, yes, I agree. It's important to measure, and it's probably stretching the project too far. But the point is, if we measure the supply, we're anywhere between 1 and 10%, depending on our definition. If we measure the demand, so that's another side of the story. And I hear myself saying this every day for the last 20 years. The demand or the interest is much higher than the supply. And it's always the question, well, why do we not see? Okay, but if you know what the interest and the demand is, that's an important part for the politics or for the production. So that's a critical piece. If we just keep saying, well, we only have 1%, then we're staying in this corner. So for me, that's part of it. Another part is, and it's an important one, which you've touched on, or we have many times today already, which projects, which categories do we include and which don't we include? And I think we can agree we don't just want to make it bigger than it is. Academics, you really do want to be objective and clear, but we don't want to make it smaller than it is either. So what is community housed, what is collaborative housing, and what is okay or what is comfortable for us? So for example, you said you didn't want to include co-living. I'm also skeptical of co-living, but I would say for a lot of the population and for people in the government, it's confusing because they think, oh, but they're offering community. For me, one of the main factors in either not including co-living or including it, but giving it a label would be that it has a high level of speculation. And for me, so this is just my own work, emphasizing common good and community and connecting that to questions of ownership, just to be clear about that. And then to say, look, there are some different levels of speculation. There's the absolute non-speculation, like let's say a Mietshäuser syndicate that we know from Germany. There's a housing cooperative, which is not very speculative. There's the co-housing, which emphasizes private ownership in many countries, but doesn't have speculation in front. And there's co-living, which is emphasizing speculation, if we're honest, as a developer-driven. But actually, they all have something to do with the community. So I'm not sure if I would throw it out, but I would give it a definite label and say, hey, warning, or be careful. This is something like community housing, but there's some other interests operating here. And then on the other end, and you see this in our book, Co-Housing Inclusive, we're experimenting also with the definitions in that book by including things like assisted living or living which is managed in a way. These can be refugees, these can be low-income people, these can be other groups who need at least to begin with, a kind of a management or housing provision. But the architecture and the concept is very much community, so, or senior citizens. So they're sharing community spaces that communities encouraged, and sometimes, in fact, they are invited to participate in the management. So I would also think about including that, and not to just make it bigger than it seems, but when I think about this in Berlin, these are big questions for policy, for where are the resources, does the city government support, allow, encourage community housing, and in fact, these kinds of cluster groups. Yeah, sometimes they're for the middle class or people like myself, but quite often they're for senior citizens or people that have dementia or something. I think, well, where's the line in between that? Actually, it's a kind of community housing. So I think it's a discussion that should be continued, that maybe we can include more things, but give it a label and say, well, this is what's different about it. Yeah.
Thanks, Michael. Indeed, that also taps on many of the discussions we had with our team when when discussing the labels, and also drawing back on past years' debates in the framework of the ENHR workshops on collaborative housing. Amongst researchers, we also discuss a lot about the boundaries, right? There's this big mother concept, as we call it, or umbrella concept of collaborative housing. And you see the differences in the way the different researchers also think about what should be in and what should be out. And we keep coming back to the same discussions, you know, it's like it never ends. But what we all agree on is that we really see a specific phenomenon in terms of how many people want to live, which has at its center the vision of a community of people who share a vision on how they want to live, and the sharing, the togetherness, all these kind of values. So it's a very value-driven type of housing, and that's something that I think we all recognize. I think Carla wanted to comment on that as well.
Well, I think on the one hand, I get a bit lost again in the term of Babel, in the sense that I'm thinking, but what is co-living then actually that Michael wants to exclude, because I'm not quite certain what it is. But before we go to that, we do actually include forms of housing that are more top-down organized, but where there is a collective thing. My own research is very much about projects that are where recent refugees work together and live together with young adults in a co-housing setup, and where they indeed can have a role in the management. So we have not excluded that at all, because I think it fits within the definition of collaborative housing. I think here the point is more about in how far are things that are emerging, but of which not that many projects exist, and how far they should already be part of it. We also can note them as emerging matters. But the question about the barriers, especially if indeed the focus goes more to professionally organized or more top-down, is an interesting and relevant one that we do establish certain temporary agreements on. I think that's the way you should see it. You can talk, you can see what happens, and then we can say, okay, for now we think it's like this. This is our temporary definition. And then things develop and you might change it again. I think it's normal. Yeah.
But on the point you made of the trend we see in professionally organized, let's say, collaborative living, I would like to hear Alice's opinion, because you work with established housing providers, right, from different sectors across Europe. Do you notice a change or a trend in the last few years, Alice? Is there more of an interest in accommodating this type of living forms amongst providers?
I see two different elements in this. So first of all, as was already mentioned by Darinka before, there are examples of, let's say, social housing federations at different levels, so more established social housing providers entering into some kind of cooperation with self-help local initiatives. So you mentioned, I think, France, probably the UK, but I even see this, and I find it quite surprising in Italy, my own country, because there the public housing sector is really 100% public public service provision, but nevertheless, because they realize the importance for collaborative housing in helping building more sustainable communities, they're really trying to work more with this kind of initiatives. So there is this, and in this respect, I think it's important to try to understand what a useful role for the, let's say, more established social housing sector could be, whether it's about helping with technical expertise, for instance. These are organizations that have entire departments dedicated to contracts, to building, and they can probably really help smaller organizations that may be struggling with indeed some of the technical aspects. But then what else is possible? What other forms of collaboration? It can even come to a point where it's about making some parts of the social housing stock available to be managed by collaborative organizations, whether they're in the form of an association or, for instance, this is something we're seeing at the local level with some examples in public housing in Milan, cooperating with a foundation, Fondazione Housing Sociale, that works on indeed more collaborative forms of living. So this is one point. And then there is one more general maybe observation, that it's the fact that elements of that are typical of collaborative housing, such as a higher degree of involvement of residents, whether it's in the choice they make about their own homes, but also in leading multiple other initiatives at the local level. This is something that we really see developing much faster in the social housing sector. And I think this has a lot to do with the need to face certain problems in social housing neighborhoods, segregation, working in deprived neighborhoods and trying to revitalize the communities. And there the sector has really understood, I think, that the only way to go about it is to work with the residents. So I think this is also something we see. We run an award every 2 years that is called the European Responsible Housing Award. And there is always a section of the award that is dedicated basically to governance and working with stakeholders. And there we see more and more interesting examples of residents' involvement and residents' empowerment coming in. So I hope this is a trend that will be even more visible in the future.
Thanks, Alice. That is very nice to hear. And indeed, we hope that we can strengthen cooperation also in terms of data collection and understanding the changes in this sector, right? And now I would like to open the floor to our audience, and that includes both the small audience we have here on the studio, but also I understand there is a chat line. Is there, right? So people who are watching us now online, they can write up questions if they want, and then we will pick them up and answer them. So would anybody sitting there in front of me here in the studio like to say something or ask something? Please introduce yourself briefly before and then ask your question. Thanks.
Okay, my name is Agatha Troost. I'm from the TU Delft Urbanism department here. Thank you a lot for this very interesting presentation. I wrote a couple of questions on different topics. So firstly, about the visualization tool. I was wondering, maybe you mentioned it, maybe I missed it, if you can actually download the data as an Excel file or a similar file to actually use it. Is it some sort of open source data that everyone can use for their own research projects? Because now it's very nicely presented in this interactive visualization tool, but I could also imagine that someone just wants to run analysis based on your data, how many co-housing projects there are in these countries. And then something about I think Darinka, you mentioned it, about what drives people to actually join these co-housing projects. And then also Carla said that, something about national surveys, because of course to answer such questions you would actually need survey data. and you already have this great start, this great first step of more administrative data that you collected for the visualization tool. But maybe there would be the next step of actually running surveys. Of course, it's a huge project, requires a lot of time, money, and people to do that, but maybe that would be something for your collab in the future. And Carla mentioned national surveys, but even then it would be a bit difficult, I think, to get enough responses from people living in co-housing to then later run statistical analysis on it, because I imagine there aren't that many people living like that, and also national surveys on housing, usually you just have a selection of that. Yeah, and I think it would be very interesting if you had actually some survey data on why people choose to live in such a form of housing, and then you could also combine it with this more administrative data, which you already have. So, for example, it seems that in Denmark it's a very popular type of housing, but are people there more idealistically motivated, or are there more pragmatic reasons? It's very interesting. And finally, maybe a bit of a controversial question, because it's about this topic of professionally provided co-housing, and is there more interest in that? I was wondering if in your research you actually encountered this idea that maybe developers and housing providers, they're attracted to co-housing because it might seem cheaper, because you need less space for people living in there. And actually at the ENHR conference a couple of weeks ago, there was a keynote presentation. I don't think any of you was in the audience, which is a bit disappointing, because the speaker said something like he very strongly criticized co-housing. Unfortunately, I forgot who that was. He very strongly criticized co-housing as an example of this neoliberal development in housing, that you live in smaller and smaller spaces, and basically it's a way for people to save money, to get people to pay more rent for smaller spaces. And I know that the type of co-housing you're studying is a bit different than that, and there was also this discussion about what exactly is co-living, which you don't include, because for you it's always a very collaborative project in which the inhabitants are involved. So I don't think that's how these people who criticize co-housing see that. But have you encountered this critique that maybe co-housing is just a part of this drive to actually make people live in smaller spaces, pay more, etc.? I personally think that an easier way to make money is to just make people live in tiny spaces without even co-housing, because you can then cram them even more. And for co-housing, you need to actually have nice shared areas, etc., which are maybe more expensive to maintain. Okay, I hope it wasn't too unclear. So basically, my questions were about the downloading data as Excel, as an Excel file or similar. Then about the surveys, would you consider actually maybe or collecting survey data in the future? And the third question was, have you encountered this criticism that co-housing is a part of this neoliberal shift?
Okay, thank you. I think the first question is for Sara. The second, I see that Carla wants to address it, and maybe I can take the third one.
Okay. Mine really quickly. Yes, you can have access to the data. We will explain it how to do it in our collab website. But yes, the data is prepared to be accessible. So the raw data, so researchers and professionals can have access and do their own research on that. So this is a way we visualize it, but they can have a look at it. Quick, Carla, you go.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that I think since we do not own the data, I think it's also partly up to the umbrella organizations that supply the data to decide with who it gets shared or not, in terms of and how far it can really be open access, which is I think what Agatha is referring to, but that is only to some extent, or that's in some extent I think beyond our own thing. In terms of the survey data and whether we would like to, I think we always want lots of money to do our own data, to do our own service. But I think what is more important is that these forms of housing should be included in already existing surveys. So now I know, for instance, that and in current surveys they make in the Netherlands, for instance, but I know this also in other countries, they make very strange decisions to exclude certain kind of houses. So, for instance, in the Amsterdam general housing survey that is quite big. Student housing is excluded because I don't know, because they're students, and then it doesn't count as housing or something like that. And similarly, in the national housing survey, some things are included. So I think it is much more practical if you have really large surveys on a national level that then also are usually used as input. And I think Alici will know about this, to aggregate at the European level to include things there. So rather than starting your own survey to hook on to already existing surveys, making them broader, I think that would be the way forward.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, of course, it would require a lot of lobbying, I think, to try and get and persuade the data collectors at the national level to include yet another question. But it's something worth, let's say, inquiring about eventually. But I think that it's a bit of a chicken and egg thing, where if you start to make noise about this way of living and the necessity of collecting reliable data to make better decisions, then it might become a need in itself, or something desirable for data collectors to do. Well, about your last point or question, Agata, well, I wasn't there when this criticism was made at the NHR, but to be honest, I mean, the last 6 years since I started working in this field, I've heard all sorts of criticisms, and most of the time, I must say, they are based on disinformation. I have no idea what this person had in mind when he or she said co-housing is neoliberal. I have people in the room who have lived for decades in co-housing, and where they are anything but neoliberal, in my view. So it's definitely not. It's like, what do they think co-housing is? Perhaps they were talking about co-living. Then I can agree. I'm very critical of co-living because research by some of my students actually has shown that many co-living projects, they claim community, they claim affordability, but in reality, they are really lowering the standards the space standards, the quality standards, and of course, community is not something you can fabricate, right? So, yeah, personally, I'm critical of the claims of co-living. I'm not necessarily critical of the freedom of developers to come up with new products. As long as there is a demand for it, people are free to start their own concept, but let's not claim that is community living as such, and that is affordable. No, the evidence shows us the opposite. So yeah, about the criticism, I cannot comment on the merits of that criticism, because it sounds to me like the person didn't really know what co-housing stands for. Michael, yeah.
Well, I think we can probably agree, the people in the room, that co-living, as it's usually described or realized, has this developer emphasis and an emphasis on speculation. So there's something from co-living. So I'm not talking about co-housing in that moment, which is the smallest spaces as possible to get the most money per square meter for the entire project. So I think there's no hiding of that. That's a confusion with co-housing model, perhaps. But at the same time, if we look at the larger level, and I'm aware of this at least in Berlin and Germany, I mean, historically, there is an argument that's used not against co-housing, but let's go back more than 100 years, an argument against cooperatives. Go back to people like Friedrich Engels. And so the more classic socialist or communist would say cooperatives is a liberal approach. It's not really solving the problem in any case, right? This housing experimentation or these nice communities are not really solving the housing problem for the masses. So that's a long argument. And I find that that the argument doesn't go away in a city like Berlin. I'm quite aware of it, that we fall in between the parties. So the left party will quite often say this to us: well, you're working with the privileged, you're doing things which are a result of a neoliberal system. So there is an argument that is made, but I think we have a good defense in this bigger world of housing cooperatives and definitely non-speculative projects. we can be doing something that's quite progressive. As I'm sitting here today, I have more the feeling that it's good to open up the definition, but to be clear about the factors or the labels that go on to them. And I think about, three models, so the institutional models or the larger providers that, in fact, are providing or managing what we're calling community housing, so housing cooperatives, also city housing companies we know in Germany, and CLTs more recently. They're all housing providers, which typically are non-speculative, which do not always provide community housing. In fact, most of the time they don't, but they can. So I think it's good to include them in the larger picture. Even the city housing companies, which we see in cities, well, in Germany, are, over the last 5 years at least, opening themselves up to community housing. Why? Because there's a need, because people are looking for it. Not because they make more money for each square meter, but because there's a social need. There's an interest in that. And so these institutions are going that way with architects. So I have the feeling that for a platform like this, it's better to use the broader definition, even to include things, as much as I don't like co-living, to include it, but to comment on it and say, well, what is going on there, or what's different about it? So for each model to be somehow clear with the factors. So what is about the architecture that's supporting community? What is about the ownership model that's supporting community? What is it maybe about the social organization that's allowing or supporting community? So to be differentiated in it. And then I think that's okay in an academic level, and it can connect to people who are working with us, and maybe hopefully to the politicians and the policy people as well.
Indeed. Thanks, Michael. I think this is something we will definitely consider. I see Alicia raising her hand. Yes?
Yeah, it's a very interesting discussion, and it's actually, it really caught my attention because I think I was there during the presentation at UNHR that was referred to. There was a lot of talking about young people eating avocado toasts and this kind of but I think overall, that still touched upon a very important point, is the issue of quality and affordability of housing, no? Because indeed, so co-living can mean very different things. Some of the examples are clearly speculative investments leading to gentrification at a local level. But I was wondering if, you said, so the taxonomy you use and the definition of collaborative housing is still very much, it's quite value based. So it's to identify value-driven communities. And whether you have some criteria and whether you include affordability as one of the main points or not, because it's also a choice to be made. What do we talk about when we talk about collaborative housing? There are forms of collaborative housing that are definitely not, that would be out of reach for many, but are they still collaborative housing or not?
Yeah, thanks, Alicia. Indeed, the affordability is one of the drivers we acknowledge in the last, let's say, in the current wave of collaborative housing. Perhaps it wasn't so much a driver in earlier days, when people were more focused on a way of living together, like a community. Also, environmental drivers have become very, very important these days. But affordability on a certain set of projects are becoming more and more important today. So we see this as a new trend, and particularly on the ones which are more professionally initiated, like what we have been discussing in some of your examples, professional providers or even NGOs or well-meaning people who want to start and empower a community or people who don't have the resources to do it themselves. So this is a very interesting new direction in collaborative housing that we see happening. And I wanted to also comment on what Michael pointed out about this very, very long-standing criticism to cooperatives. And in connection to what Agatha brought up, it is true that indeed the cooperative way of providing housing has been always falling between the cracks of neoliberal tendencies or right-wing and socialist. But I was really, I really like something that I read in one of Richard Sennet's books, where he traces the story of the socialist movement in the 19th century in Europe, and he distinguishes two currents. One is the socialists who value very much mutual help. So in that sense, they are more friendly towards cooperatives in all forms, not only housing, but cooperatives in general. And the other one is a more top-down, welfare state kind of socialist tradition, which sees cooperatives as a private interest endeavor. And they actually rejected for that reason. So it's a really fascinating history of how different political parties have regarded cooperatives. And this actually explains, partly at least, why in the Netherlands, over 100 years ago, when the housing law was published at that time, I think it was in 1905, Carla, correct me if I'm wrong, the vehicle to provide housing for most of the population was not cooperative housing because it was too private for the socialists and too socialist for the for the right-wing people, to put it simply. So it was not pleasing either of the different political camps. So I think this is something that still lingers, right? And we have to deal with it also definitionally. But I would like to give the opportunity to one more question. Perhaps, Valérie, do you have a question from the online audience?
Yes, indeed. We have a number of questions and remarks from the online audience. So to the online audience, thank you very much. First of all, some comments. It's about data and about collection. So people are commenting that UK data is limited, so it only considers CLTs, for example. In Sweden, it's also incomplete because eco-villages and building groups are not included. And that raises the questions, first of all, who will keep data up to date about your tool specifically, and also who will add data from other countries? But then on a more national organizational level, what motivations do national organizations have to contribute to European-wide initiatives like this? And maybe can this link to the EU resolution of affordable housing?
Oh, very interesting questions and suggestions. All I can say is we will take them on board. Of course, we have thought about these questions as a group. We're very keen to try and find a way to sustain this effort over time. And we have also worked hard to make it a very user-friendly or management-friendly or easy-to-manage platform, right? Maybe, Sara, you can say something about that.
No, well, about the incomplete information, as I mentioned, so this is a starting point, and this is the umbrella organizations we managed to engage. But as I mentioned, we're also in touch with this cooperative housing organization at the UK, who will hopefully use this filtering we created. So then we could also include this kind of data. And yeah, as we mentioned many times, this is a starting point. It's very incomplete, but the idea is that throughout time, this will be more and more accurate and representative. But of course, this will depend on funding, on people able to continue this, but we want this to continue.
Yeah, and about the interest of national data collection agencies, well, I think this is, as I said before, it's an effort of making this type of housing more visible, showing the added value that it can have to solving the many housing challenges that we're experiencing across Europe, and, well, try to find a way to cooperate on data collection efforts. So this is what we can offer as a starting point, and we very much welcome any further comments, any further offers for data, offers for cooperation, offers for money, of course, are also welcome. They are always welcome. It's always needed. And I would like to warmly thank again our speakers, Alice over there in Brussels, Carla up in the north of the Netherlands right now, Michael, who has come from Berlin, and please stay tuned because we still have a very interesting program of events the rest of today. I feel like a TV host, so stay tuned. We have a seminar on financing collaborative housing forms from 1 to 4. And then we will have the BK Talks, again with Michael, but also 3 other very, very interesting speakers from 6 to 8. So thanks a lot and see you later.
Thank you.